We see this all the time. We have a big issue that we're very interested in, like climate change, and all of a sudden the world intervenes, disrupts. And maybe just to start, Aaron, if you could give a perspective on just how climate change is a threat to security, and how do you keep policymakers' attention in a time when there are a lot of other things going on. So over to you, please.
Sure. Thanks so much, Rich. And thanks to the Schar School for hosting this event and giving me the opportunity to teach on this topic. I'm in my second semester of teaching here after a career in the U.S. intelligence community before coming to the Center for Climate and Security. To your question on, how is climate change a national security issue? I think the important thing to think about is how climate change is reshaping assumptions about how the world works, right? It is changing the landscape from the tactical to the strategic of international relations and international risk. Everything from putting military bases in the US and other parts of the world at risk from extreme weather events, undermining military readiness, as troops, say, in California have to interrupt training days due to wildfires and poor air quality and divert from training to firefighting in California, to the international stage where climate is putting stress in communities that are already under a lot of stress. So places like the Middle East, West Africa, Somalia, and East Africa, the Mekong Delta. I mean, sometimes I joke that you could spin a globe, put your finger down, and you can find a climate security risk. But as climate change, decreases food security and decreases water security in these communities, brings populations who maybe are in the Sahel, for example, farmers and herders, into contact with one another more regularly because the weather patterns have changed. All of that puts stress into the system, creates instability, creates risk of conflict, and exacerbates concerns that the United States is already worried about. And then between states, you'll see increasing competition over access to resources. There's really just a whole host of ways where you have these, whether it's warming temperatures, changing weather patterns, increased extreme weather events. All of these things are reshaping the national security landscape. And you asked about how do you keep policymaker focus on this? And there was actually a really interesting article in the New York Times this morning with a headline saying that the focus on climate change has waned now that everyone's focused on Ukraine and focused on getting energy to Europe. And I think the key is to talk about climate change and climate security, not as separate from all of these other challenges, right? It's not one other thing that we're racking and stacking and deciding what's most important, but instead we're looking at how climate change shapes all of these challenges and changes them. So that's not just the climate office that needs to worry about this, not just John Kerry and his special envoy hat at the State Department, but it's the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe or the Near East, right? Because they need to understand how climate change is shaping the risks in their area. And if they don't bring that lens to it, they're going to miss things, right? They're going to get stuff wrong. And I think that's a really important framing that we bring to the topic when we talk to policymakers, so they get it and understand why it shapes their world. And I can talk about this all day, but I'll stop to turn to other people. But we'll stop there.
Well, that's a good way to sort of talk about broader public policy issues. And Bonnie, I really would welcome your perspective on this. I'm teaching a class on the theory and practice of public policy, and I use climate change and energy as kind of an example of how many public policy issues, whether they're health related, education, kind of cut across this. And I'd appreciate your perspective on this, perhaps not so much from you can comment on the national security dimension, but I think, particularly as a broader public policy issue and how a school like Schar should address it.
Oh, yes. Well, thanks so much, Rich. I think what I can contribute to this conversation is just a small perspective on what we can offer with our public policy degree programs. So as you mentioned, that class, all of our degree programs will leave our students with particular tools that they can bring to bear on these public problems that confront us. And one of those things is how to characterize these problems to create broad support for fixing them, right? To bring the forces across systems to bear. So as Erin said, we're dealing with food shortage, financial market stability, all kinds of things and when we talk in this class that you just mentioned, Theory and Practice of Public Policy, we talk about how to conceptualize issues to engage the public and policymakers, and bringing, fanning out the descriptors and the contributors to these problems so that we can bring public policy awareness, bring public awareness to them. And we think that through our degree programs, we offer tools that people can begin to use in their jobs as policymakers, policy analysts, policy implementers. So I think that that contextual issues, like becoming conversant with the contextual issues, but then also having some of the quantitative and qualitative tools to use to address them in their careers in public service or public facing service are the things that are undergraduate too, but graduate degrees can really contribute. And I mean, my personal interest in research is, you mentioned that I founded the Gender and Policy Center. And so in that context, my little piece of this is thinking about disparities in outcomes in the public and, for underrepresented groups or disadvantaged groups. And whenever any kind of critical event like this confronts us, we know that those currently at a disadvantage will be even more more disparities will be created and more vulnerability for those populations. So that's a particular interest of mine, and various of our centers bring attention to those issues as well. But I defer to the subject matter experts where international security is concerned on the panel for the nitty gritty on these topics.
I'm glad you brought up the equity issue, because I think a lot of the practical implications of climate change fall on disadvantaged populations, women and children in particular. And as we talk about public policy, it's not just, as Erin said, the John Kerry level. It's got to be down to the human level as well. One area when we talk about climate change and national security that we don't always think first about, Ken, is the trade area, and there are so many different ways that climate change affect trade relationships. How do you see this fitting into your approach to teaching in the trade area?
Yeah, this has impacts both in the area of trade and in issues related to development. In the Schar School, we've got a few courses on development. I teach one, but others do as well. And so this can impact development patterns, but also not just national security, but what we refer to as human security. Yes. And this gets into, issues of disadvantaged people, but more broadly, looking at how these changes impact the lives of individuals rather than just the security situations of countries. And so this is really at the forefront of some of the things that we do. In the trade realm, just a few things. First, with sort of a big picture with the global economy, estimates of direct subsidies for petroleum consumption are on the order of $500 billion a year. So we are subsidizing in a very big way exactly what we should not be doing from the point of view of ameliorating climate change trends. So at the top of the agenda is to somehow begin to back out those subsidies, which distort the world economy in the direction that we do not want to go. And then secondly, is the correct pricing of carbon. And this is critically important, although it's become a bit of a political football in the United States. This can be done through direct carbon taxes or it can be done through what used to be called tradable pollution permits, and we now refer to that as cap and trade. The EU has a system. So after backing out subsidies, the next issue would be correctly pricing carbon. So different economies and players in different economies can be making appropriate decisions in the face of those prices. And then third is to, sort of support and recommit ourselves to the multilateral trading system. One way that climate change shows up is through food prices. And we will probably go through a period of increasing food prices exacerbated by the conflict in Ukraine, because Ukraine is an exporter of wheat on a large scale. But climate change affects food prices. And there's a tendency when food prices begin to spike for countries to begin to put in place export controls to keep food within the country. And that interrupts trading relationships. It tends to make food prices spike higher. It tends to make food prices more volatile. And so that is the opposite of what we need to be doing in the face of climate change impacts on food prices. We've had an episode of this back in 2007, 2008, sort of a test run for what not to do. And trade economists emphasize that we need to do better the next time around.
Greg, there are a whole range of public health related issues. We're going through, I don't want to say the end of the COVID crisis, but COVID is a good reminder that, as geopolitics sometimes distracts policymakers' attention, other kinds of global public health issues do the same. And how do you see something, like the COVID crisis interacting with climate change, and then more broadly in some of the issues you're dealing with in biodefense?
Sure. So there's actually a pretty close connection between climate change and global health security in general. And I'll just make 3 points. The first is that a lot of the human activities that contribute to climate change, like deforestation, urbanization, converting natural lands into agricultural uses, these are all the same factors that lead to epidemics and pandemics. And so if we want to deal with the root causes of both pandemics and climate change, right, we're going to have the same set of policies that we're going to need to be looking at, understanding how these policies will affect both these different domains. And a big reason for that is that most epidemics and pandemics are caused by zoonotic diseases that affect both humans and animals. And so this leads to the second point, which is climate change, and especially kind of the warming of certain climates, is going to increase the geographic range of a lot of the disease vectors that have previously only been of concern in tropical areas. But now we're going to see mosquitoes and other insects that are able to spread malaria, yellow fever, dengue, Zika virus, have much broader geographic range. By one estimate, in the next couple of decades, another 1 billion people will live in areas that disease-bearing mosquitoes are active in. And so that's going to change the face of global health in ways that we just have not seen previously. And this raises the importance of what's called One Health, which is looking seriously at both human health and animal health, because they are inextricably interlinked. And one of the big reasons for that is because of these zoonotic diseases. Whenever humans and wildlife kind of encroach on one another or move in each other's domains, we're also intruding into a viral ecosystem that suddenly has new human hosts that they can jump to, right? And that's fundamentally the cause of the current pandemic we're experiencing. So the pandemic is a good wake-up call and illustration of the importance of this One Health idea and the need to look at policies that are not just about what is human behavior, but also looking at how do we make sure that animal health isn't being compromised by climate change, and mitigating any impacts there to make sure that we've got measures in place to reduce the risk that diseases will jump from animal populations to human populations.
Yeah, that's a great reminder to keep the multidimensional nature of the public health challenge in mind as we address these issues. Aaron, maybe back to you in terms of not only particular countries who may be more vulnerable than others from a not just from climate, but from the national security dimension. But also if you started to think, we've just finished the Glasgow meeting, COP26 Committee of Parties in November, and all of a sudden we're going to be going to Sharm el-Sheikh for COP27, all in the middle of all of these other challenges. But maybe, just a comment about sort of the countries that may be most vulnerable and how their concerns get reflected in these massive global conferences, which seem so remote from people that you wonder how we're ever collectively going to address climate.
Sure, those are good questions, and unfortunately, often the views or needs of the countries that are hit hardest by climate change and climate security risks are the ones whose voices are not privileged as much at some of these meetings, or even if their voices are privileged, perhaps what they're asking for is not given in many cases, which a lot of the focus from countries that are hit the hardest is on what's called loss and damage, which is getting climate adaptation funding, right? Countries that are being hit the hardest are the ones that have emitted the least historically. And so getting the help that they need from the countries that have done the emitting to prepare and adapt and be ready to deal with some of the baked in changes which are coming. I think that's an important thing to recognize when we talk about climate change and we talk about climate security, is that even if all emissions were cut tomorrow, given the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere, the trajectory that we're on, there is some warming that's baked in for the next few decades. And so adapting or preparing to absorb that shocks and risks that are coming is really important at the same time that we talk about mitigation and avoiding catastrophe in the second half of the century. And so a climate security strategy or climate security approach needs to include both cutting emissions and adapting. You asked about which countries are most vulnerable. There's been some really interesting work done through USAID by Dr. Josh Busby and others, looking at how do you understand vulnerability to climate security risks. And the work that they did identified what they called a double burden of countries that are already highly fragile also being the most vulnerable to climate shocks. So they get stuck in this loop of you don't have the ability to prepare or absorb the shocks, and then the shocks come and they further reduce your ability to prepare. The other thing they looked at is that states need both strong capabilities and legitimacy. So having the capabilities to respond to the climate shocks alone isn't enough. You also need trust from the population with the government. You need those marginalized groups that we were talking about earlier to have some kind of voice, right? Not to have lots of tensions and polarization internally. And so even though a lot of the countries they identified in this double burden, and when we talk about fragile states, we're often talking about sub-Saharan Africa, again, South Asia, parts of the Middle East, I would argue that we need to look at climate security risks in states that have traditionally been considered stable as well, because the shocks that are coming due to climate change are so intense and are like nothing we have seen before, right? The Defense Department released a report in the fall looking at called a climate risk assessment. And they made the point that the US Defense Department, they made the point that you can't look to the past to understand how the future is going to unfold when it comes to climate change. And therefore, even places that have traditionally been considered stable could be rendered unstable given the types of climate shocks and that factor of legitimacy and governance. Which is why I like being on a panel with experts and all these other topics. And as you were talking about earlier, Rich, about that multi-dimensional approach, right? You can't understand this just by looking at it through one angle. You have to bring in these other dynamics as well, because they all combine to create climate security risks.
I'm glad you reminded us about this flow and stock problem of the dealing with emissions, because one set of policies and technologies may work if you're trying to reduce the rate of emissions, but unlikely to help if you're trying to, essentially draw down the stock of carbon that's part of the problem when we deal with climate issues. But that, it does raise an interesting question of, well, where do you start to deal with these problems? We, having been in the State Department, we think about country to country negotiations, big meetings like the Glasgow meeting, and yet if we don't start at the local level, we're not really going to make change that has an impact. And one point I try to make in my class is that there are different tools available depending on what level of governance you're involved in. And we don't really pay enough attention to what goes on at the local level. And we can talk about national and international targets, but our Center for Energy and Science Policy as a pilot project with the city of Manassas, where we're trying to help them develop a climate action plan. Well, if we can relate this to where people are in their daily lives, I think it has a bigger impact. Bonnie, I'd appreciate your reaction to this. When we think about public policy, do we overly, since we're so close to DC, overly think the national part and not pay enough attention to the subnational?
Yes, certainly. I mean, that argument could be made. And what I would say is in our public administration program, for instance, we really think about who's at the front line of the delivery of services in democracy, right? And we call this street level bureaucracy. And if we look at the pandemic as an example, we see that, think about some recent crises, including the pandemic and access to voting. And where those things hit the road is at the very local level, right? The right to vote and the administration of vaccines is happening at a very local level. And there's a tremendous variability across the country as to how that's implemented based on what's happening in different jurisdictions. So that's something that certainly the study of public administration and how policy gets implemented advances our thinking into how to do those things better. And in the case of the additional crisis of climate change and the many cascading consequences that will be associated with it.
We've got an interesting question in the chat that Greg, you may want to talk about too, because we always look at technology and the role that it can play, whether we're trying to solve a public health issue or climate change. And one topic that always comes up when we talk about low carbon green energy futures is the role of nuclear power. We in the Commonwealth of Virginia, I think it's something like 30% of our electricity comes from nuclear power. And because of the crisis in Europe over the past winter, the French are talking about revisiting nuclear power as a alternative source to natural gas. But give us your sense about the role of technology and any thoughts you might have on the nuclear issue.
Well, on the nuclear energy issue, I do think that will be a key component of clean energy in the future, since burning of fossil fuels is such a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. We need to, at the same time, maintain the level of energy production we have, given the way our societies and our economies are structured. So, renewables are great and need to be, invested in heavily, but nuclear does play a role. And then, of course, the downside is that nuclear energy also has potential proliferation risks. And the same technologies that are used to enrich uranium or process plutonium that could be used as fuel for nuclear reactors could also be used to produce nuclear weapons. So the more countries that invest in nuclear energy as part of an effort to diversify their energy supplies and develop more carbon-free energy will increase the risks of nuclear proliferation, or at least the latent capabilities there. The good news is we have the IAEA that's able to monitor these developments and conduct inspections and make sure this technology is being used peacefully. But there are other technologies that are being developed that will hopefully also play similar positive roles. So one of those is synthetic biology. There's a lot of hope that we can use biological means of producing chemicals, for example, that don't involve using petroleum-based products, right? And so you could have green production of chemicals that are needed for commercial industrial purposes. And so there's a lot of energy being put into the synthetic biology field for developing, cleaner, eco-friendly materials and chemicals. The downside, again, is that synthetic biology also has potential to produce biological weapons and be misused to cause harm. And we need to have safeguards in there as well to make sure that those technologies are being maximized, optimized for beneficial purposes and not being misused. But unfortunately, there is no bioequivalent of the IEA. And this is an area where there are a lot more work needs to be done. And this is one area where the Biodefense program is active. I'm personally involved in a project now with colleagues in the UK where we are working on global biorisk governance that would encompass both reducing risks of pandemics as well as the misuse of technologies like synthetic biology. So there's a lot of areas where climate change impacts a lot of other areas that we work on here at the Schar School. And just to echo, Bonnie's point earlier about the types of degrees here, I would argue that pretty much any degree you get here, you can use to fight climate change. It's not the degree that matters, it's how you use it, how you use your knowledge and your experience and your networks and your passion for this issue that really matters. So, I think the Schar School has a lot of options there to offer for those who are interested in tackling climate change one way or another.
Rich, could I just add a
Please
quick
jump in. Yeah.
I'd also do, not to downplay, the potential role of nuclear, but there's a small revolution going on in household level distributed solar right now in parts of the world, India, Bangladesh, parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And these can have a huge impact in delivering basic energy to households, through solar, photovoltaic, LED, and small refrigeration units, which also contributes to food security and health security. So that's, one thing to keep track of because there's a lot changing there. And then also just to very quickly respond to your local level question, issues, or I should say, experiments in local level agroecology can have a huge impact here. They can be more efficient in the use of water. They can better be tailored to local climates and soils and are inherently less energy intensive. So there's a small revolution going on in that realm as well that's worth keeping track of.
Yeah, it's a lot of small revolutions make for big change. You mentioned that, some of these really exciting developments that are going on in developing countries. One of the things that Mason did this past summer was to organize 17 rooms around the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. And I was responsible for the room on energy for all, basically the theme there. And what came out of that discussion was as much as we want to achieve this green energy future, you have 600 to 800 million people who simply don't have electricity at all. And somehow you have to find a way of meeting that need at the same time. I think you deal with the big picture. The other thing, and I'd really appreciate your reaction to this. We focus so much on low carbon in power, and I've got a good question on electric vehicles in a minute. But so many of the things, the goods that we produce and trade have a carbon content in them, whether it's plastics, steel. How do you see the trade issue playing out when you've got the EU talking about putting tariffs on goods that have a high carbon content in them, and what the implications that might be for global trade?
Just personally, I don't think the EU proposal is a very good one. I think that rather than immediately jump to tariffs, which I mean, to be honest, are also dual use in that they're protective of domestic industries. Proper energy pricing, including of the fuel used in container shipping, is the way to get at those issues. We tend to think that tariffs are, to be used for everything. And, they're kind of a go-to policy because they're politically interesting, but they're generally speaking not appropriate instruments for achieving the objectives that we're looking for.
Like sanctions, right? They're the easy thing to reach for when a policymaker wants to.
Yes, and in many cases, tariffs are sanctions.
Sanctions, yeah.
And those two realms get mixed up increasingly as we're moving into an era with more nationalistic country governments.
Aaron, one thing I'd like you to talk a bit about is kind of the role of DoD, just thinking in U.S. terms on, dealing with this climate change issue, both as, some of the things we've been talking about in terms of, instability in certain countries, but more also, their own practices. I mean, DoD is probably the biggest consumer of energy and bigger than many countries. And so, there are things that can be done in that respect, as well as, how do you help out developing more resilient responses to climate events?
Yeah, of course. So, at the end of last year, President Biden released an executive order on sustainability in the federal government. And it laid out a whole list of different ways that agencies across the government would move toward renewable energy to help drive market demand for new technologies and for moving toward clean energy. And DoD, of course, the Department of Defense, is a huge part of that executive order because they are, as you say, the largest consumer of energy in the federal government, and in compared to some small countries, they're bigger. And so there's a whole host of ways that the Department of Defense is moving toward a focus on renewable energy. The Army just released its climate strategy a couple of weeks ago, and it's a really interesting document. It's got 3 different lines of effort. It's very tactical and tangible. It talks about moving to all electric vehicles in the non-tactical fleet by, I believe, 2037. Talks about getting a microgrid on every base and installation by 2050. Talks about other movements toward renewable energy in other ways. And the key is that the Army framed this whole document not as, they're doing this because they're a bunch of tree huggers, but they're doing this because they know that it serves U.S. national security interests, right? It not only makes them better able to protect and keep Americans safe, but it also by trying to spur demand for clean energy and a faster move to renewable energy, that will reduce some of the climate security risks that they're going to have to manage and deal with. I mean, in terms of I mentioned earlier, either wildfires and crises here within the United States or abroad when they have to respond to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief missions in places like the Pacific. I mean, really anywhere. So under Secretary Austin's leadership, they've named a it's a chief sustainability officer now at the Pentagon. They've got people in positions, climate advisors in each of the services. But again, to mainstream this and make sure it's not just a political issue that kind of changes depending on who's in the White House, they're also really focusing on education of soldiers and of staff and civilians throughout the department, so they understand why it's part of their job to care about climate change.
I'm glad you mentioned the education part, because I often wonder if, and potential students in the audience may be asking the same thing, how do we as Schar, or more generally, prepare our students, for this changed environment that they're going to be dealing with when it comes to climate and climate related issues. I think not just George Mason, but other universities are are looking at this as well. And we see junior colleges around the United States doing so many innovative things in terms of retraining as well as equipping people for the new work environment. Bonnie, I don't know if, this is the sort of thing that comes up, as you talk to colleagues in other schools here at Mason or in your own work.
Well, I mean, as far as schools, they're doing everything from the very micro level to sort of eliminating one-use plastics, right? So that's something that happens across the university. So you see initiatives like that express some concern, but then you see at the macro level, the attempts on the part of, for instance, our faculty, or as we think about curricular development, we're thinking about how we can bring our collective knowledge to bear on problems like this. So one of the things that we do when we think through what the school will address is, how we can have events like this, but also more meaningfully in the curriculum, bring together dialogue that, brings to light all the very many facets of problems like this. So it's kind of all different levels. And then it's partnering with different organizations and schools across the university. So at George Mason, we have an Institute for Sustainable Earth. We have various different organizations where we work interdisciplinarily with our colleagues in the Volgenau School or the College of Health and Human Services, for instance. So policy, in our view, is a part of all of this, right? That the knowledge that you get from science, it's clearly important that we stress education at every level in our population, because without that conversancy, the ability to handle scientific knowledge or, to think through things analytically, we have a big problem on our hands, right? But also at the university level, that's something that we're trying to make happen for people across every level of the population.
Have a good question about electric vehicles from the participants. How there's a big push now. Everybody wants a Tesla, excuse me, in their backyard. But the implications of that, are huge when it comes to things like is the electric grid capable of handling all of the policy priority that's being given to EVs, and can, kind of a trade related issue to this, the need for rare earth minerals and lithium and cobalt for batteries carries with it its own kinds of trade problems, but also in particular in Africa, in Democratic Republic of Congo, cobalt and child labor, and so it's, we want this to do the right thing in terms of our overall goals for climate policy, but there are these unintended consequences that also, from a policy point of view, need to be tended to, I think.
Yeah, I think the short answer on the grid issue is yes, it's going to strain the grid. And I'm not sure that we're ready for that. But with regard to materials going into electric vehicles, there has been another small revolution in attention to global value chains and looking at global value chains from both a social and an ecological perspective and a human rights perspective. And this is something that various NGOs are involved in, but the private sector as well is being forced into this realm. And the basic idea is that as a perhaps end user or consumer in a global value chain, you have some responsibility through your contractual relationships to earlier stages in that value chain.
Right.
And that could be forced labor, it could be corruption, environmental degradation. And you're absolutely right that with some of these materials, there are a lot of issues with regard to mining, forced labor. And in the mining sector, this is one that stands out as a sector that adversely affects governance. And, you know, in the Schar School, we're interested in governance, a great deal at all levels, but the mining sector is sort of the poster child for bad governance in many countries, and electric vehicles of necessity interact with that. So it's something that we need and are paying closer attention to.
Great. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the value chain. That's really, really critical. Greg, I was thinking about the cyber dimension to this, and we have a question from the audience about, you know, whether in fact the Russian move into Ukraine is some kind of resource grab, but more precisely, you know, now cyber is almost a given in terms of a tool, if you will, to disrupt other societies. And you know, even now in the United States, power grids, companies are very concerned about foreign misuse of cyber against our own institutions.
Oh, yeah, I think so. There are kind of two different issues here. I mean, one is we've had repeated demonstrations that the critical infrastructure in this country is vulnerable to a lot of things. Just look what happened to Texas during the really severe winter weather, and they lost their ability to pump natural gas and heat homes. And that that fragility, that lack of resilience is there because we haven't been investing in the right infrastructure for a long time. And there are both natural disasters that could cause these things, as well as malicious acts, including cyber attacks, as well as the increased demands imposed by climate change that's going to tax the the electrical system in southern states that are going to have to be running more in order to provide more air conditioning and that sort of thing. So I think there are some systemic structural issues that are being revealed that we need to address for a variety of reasons, right? Climate change is definitely one of them. Cyber threats and just natural disasters is another one. So in the US, I think we're going to have to, as we invest more in infrastructure, as we're trying to do, put a lot more thought into how do we build resilient, sustainable infrastructure that's going to last throughout however many generations we're going to be dealing with climate change. On the issue about Russia and Ukraine, I mean, Ukraine has been called the breadbasket of Eastern Europe, and they are that is true. They have a lot of other natural resources. I think what's going on though in terms of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is more about politics and less about natural resources. And Rich can provide a much more eloquent and articulate description of Putin's motivations here and the whole history of this region. But my take is definitely this being driven by Vladimir Putin's vision of restoring Russian grandeur to the former Soviet level, and his own personal political interests and staying in power and making sure that Ukraine is a vassal state that isn't able to exercise its sovereignty and make alignments with the countries and the alliances that it wants to. I think there's just unfortunate side effect that this will also disrupt supply chains and leave more resources in the hands of Putin's oligarchs. But I do think that is a side effect, not a cause of the current crisis we're seeing.
No, I'd agree with you too. I don't think it's a resource grab, but if anybody thinks they know what Putin's next move is, I don't believe them. It's going to be a surprise. Aaron, we had another interesting question on, and you've lived through this, where you've had a change in, let's describe this as neutrally as we can, a change in political direction, in the United States in terms of how you approach climate change, and particularly how the Defense Department gets involved in it. And there, you kind of get a sense that people are being whipsawed from one extreme to another. And yet, I know from the work, that you're doing in the Center for Climate Security, there's an element of continuity in terms of addressing these climate change issues that sort of goes beyond, if you will, the president of the day. Am I oversimplifying that?
No, not at all. And actually, I mean, climate security has been an area of bipartisan action and support, particularly on Capitol Hill, over the past few decades. Sorry, my 2-year-old is asking me to come upstairs. Excuse me.
Bring him in. We need some
Yeah.
additional panelists here.
But so Congress has passed through the National Defense Authorization Bill in recent years, has passed provisions requiring the Department of Defense to do more on climate resilience. And those have been passed in Republican Congresses and signed by Republican presidents. And so congressional action is one way to make sure it continues. I think the other way is just for people in the Defense Department to understand that it's critical to their mission to bring that climate lens to their work. And the more they absorb that and understand that, the less it, again, as I said earlier, it becomes a political issue, and more it's just like, this is what we need to do to manage our mission, because climate change is coming regardless of who's in the White House, right? And so if the Defense Department wants to be able to operate in that changed world, they need to address these issues.
Anyone else want to have a go at how we deal with shifting political priorities on a problem that is not going to go away, whoever sits in the White House?
I would mention, just to follow up on Aaron, that my own work on basic goods provision and water and energy and food, I stumbled across a report that was published in 2014 by the Center for Naval Analysis. It was entitled National Security and the Accelerating Risk of Climate Change. And it was extraordinary reading it, because it was very clear that this entity, which is part of the US military, was entirely on board with climate science and was raising the alarm over exactly the sorts of risks that we're talking about in this session. So I think in some respects, DOD is out in front on this. And the politicians need to catch up with the DOD because we've got a lot of military students in the Schar School, and they're a sharp group of individuals who are somewhat apolitical and are very much interested in analysis, and that kind of analysis is taking place within the defense apparatus of the United States.
Well, and all you need to do is get a group of current and former naval officers together, and they'll convince you right away about the challenge of rising sea levels. Here's an interesting question that comes from the audience, and it's kind of addressed to Bonnie, sort of. But it does raise an issue that I talk to my students a lot about, and that is, how do you convince people, real people, who may be skeptical about either climate change as a problem, as a political issue? In my time in the State Department, we spent a lot of effort on public diplomacy, and to a certain extent, there has to be a public diplomacy aspect of bringing the climate change issue more to the everyday life of citizens. So, how can you describe this problem in a way that's going to generate more support rather than more polarization?
So I guess one thing I can say before I pass it over, and hopefully you all, my co-panelists, have some solutions here, but usually every class I say, well, we're not going to solve this tonight, but
oh, sure we will.
We'll go back to the tool element, which is we do study political communication, the development of political narratives and policy narratives, how those are developed, reading everything from George Orwell and the Politics of the English Language to Justin Guest, who's one of our faculty, his book on political communication, how to do it effectively, in all different kinds of outlets. And so that's one element of what we study. And I think becoming savvy consumers of how information is promulgated is part of our policy degree program. And, I think about these narrative strains in the space of gender and policy, and look at different theoretical frames that help us understand this, such as social construction frames and intersectionality and the like. But I wonder if our other panelists might have something to say about ways to bring this to the public that in a way that makes the issues salient to them.
I can't say I have any great ideas here, except that what we've seen during the pandemic makes me very pessimistic about our ability to communicate effectively on climate change, because the pandemic has been an immediate global catastrophe with immediate, dramatic, acute symptoms and levels of illness and death, and yet we still have a large portion of the population resistant to different public health measures, or some people not even believing the nature of the pandemic. And this is not just in the US, but in other countries as well. And climate change is a much more diffuse threat, much more long-term. It doesn't have the immediacy that the pandemic has, even though the effects, I think, are equally widespread and insidious and long-lasting. It's just doesn't have that same kind of visceral reaction as the pandemic, which is, spreading like wildfire, across every community. So I think our challenges are going to be even higher in that area. And and now we also have the last couple of years, right? We've had this rise in disinformation coming from a variety of sources, and that's a whole new policy challenge that we need to tackle. And actually, just this semester, we started offering a new course on countering disinformation, because we recognize that this is a problem that's not just about COVID, it's not just about the election, it's not just about climate change, it's just seeped into our society and culture in ways that are very corrosive and very dangerous. And so we now need to treat that as a specific kind of challenge we need to deal with, and we need to make sure that our students are educated about, what is disinformation, where does it come from, how does it work, and most importantly, how do we counter it? So I think we are doing things in either specific classes or embedding a lot of this stuff into existing classes that do help prepare students to work on these issues in a variety of capacities.
I'm glad you mentioned wildfires. Aaron, I know you have to go, but we have a question from our participants about the serious climate risks due to wildfires, particularly toxic smoke. Is this worse today than it was, say 30 years ago? And are there measures that we can take to reduce that chemical threat that comes from wildfires?
I'm not sure if you were asking me that directly. I don't actually,
Well,
I don't have the technical background to know that. But the only thing I will say is I do think this gives an example of how we think about redefining what national security is, right? And where do we spend our time and focus in terms of keeping Americans and America safe. And threats like this from climate change are directly affecting Americans' health, Americans' livelihoods, American safety and security in a way that we haven't seen previously. So when we think about resources and where do we put those resources for national security, anyway, that's something we talk about a lot in the class that I teach, is how do we, when we're talking about climate change and national security, what do we mean when we say security, and how do we need to redefine it for the world in which we now live?
We are approaching the magic hour. Ken, any last minute comments, Bonnie, before we close off here?
I'll just give us something to think about as we leave, and that is climate refugees and the impact of climate change on migration. That's not something we've talked about. We've got classes on migration in the Schar School. And so that is a realm that we have not had a chance to talk about, but very important to think about.
Including in our own country. It's not just something that happens in Ethiopia or someplace as well.
A lot of, of the migration from Central America, we can begin to think about in terms of climate refugees.
Yeah. Well, look, go ahead, Bonnie.
I just wanted to offer us a modicum of hope, because policy issues are very heavy, and a lot of times thinking about how do we address them and mitigate them can be a lot. But one thing I would say on a hopeful front is that directing our own activities purposefully towards crafting such solutions really can give us a collective sense of well-being and purpose. And that's something I think that the degree programs we have offer, because we do feel like we're taking purposeful action to address these very real and present dangers. And that's something that we feel good about every day, because we're in dialogue with students and colleagues who are directing their activities towards addressing these issues. And that is a very hopeful thing.
Well, I just want to thank all of you for being such a great panel. We could probably go on for another hour, but you've really, I think, demonstrated just the breadth of the interest in the Schar School on these kinds of issues, which are increasingly of interest to our students. So thank you all very much. And